I tend to be more of a risk taker in life because you got to risk it for the biscuit. But sometimes when those risks don't pay off, you actually end up losing really big. So today I'm going through the riskiest players in 2025 fantasy football, and I'm going to walk you through exactly why they're risky so you can ultimately determine if they're worth taking the risk. Just make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support if you get value from this information today. So the first guy that I want to get into, I've had a lot of discussions about with personal friends of mine, with people in the comments section, and this has really been bothering me for a while with Saquon Barkley, who I have now determined is actually a very risky pick in 2025 fantasy football. Now, before I get into the research that I've done regarding Saquon Barkley and other running backs like him, I do want to admit also the real reason why I just really wanted to look more into Saquon Barkley is because the conversations about Saquon Barkley have always been centered around RB1s and future volume after they had enormous seasons like Saquon Barkley just had. The conversation always revolved around he probably won't do it again. And I always thought that was right, so I wanted to look into it. And I've also been battling this as well. I was wrong on Saquon Barkley last year when I said he was not worth his draft price. So I've just kind of taken a 180 on Saquon for the most part and just been really pro Saquon. But I had to dive into this research. So essentially what I did was I went back to 2014 and I started looking at running backs who had over 350 touches and a big year in fantasy football. And the reason I wanted to go through it is because I wanted to see what the volume was going to be like the following year and their effectiveness to become a top 5, top 10 back once again. So I started out, and you can see the list of guys on here. There's some guys with serious volume here, like DeMarco Murray in 2014, if y'all remember this, 450 total touches. Like, that is absolutely absurd. That's 28.1 touches per game. That is a ridiculous number. You can also see multiple guys made this list multiple times. Adrian Peterson was on this list a couple times. Zeke Elliott, Le'Veon Bell, Saquon Barkley himself has been on this list several times as well. So you can see the amount of touches that they had in their big season and the touches per game that amounted to. And then obviously the most valuable piece of information when it comes to Saquon Barkley is what the following year the total touches amount was, the amount of games they played, and the touches per game. And the big takeaways here that you need to absolutely come away from was that 100% of these guys all lost volume. There wasn't a single guy who was able to maintain that level of volume. Now, you might say to me, well, Ryan, that doesn't really matter. Like, Saquon Barkley could still really be the running back one with 350 touches, 330 touches, because Saquon Barkley had 378 total touches here. So he doesn't necessarily have to go back to that number to be the running back one. I actually agree with you. But here's also what's really concerning. 94.4% of those guys, they drop below 350 touches. So if Saquon Barkley drops below 350 touches, we're talking about 30 touches lost for Saquon Barkley. That's not exactly a great thing. And what's the most concerning of all is that 88.9% of these guys, they lost 60 plus touches. So realistically, the history against Saquon Barkley is pretty insurmountable for him to even sniff within 60 touches of that 378 that he got in 2024. Now, also the important information to know is that if you look at the average games that were played the following season by all these guys, all 18 of them, it was 10.5 games. Now, there were some guys that did play, 16 games or did play 17 games the following year. Kudos to those guys. But there was also guys who got injured because their bodies couldn't handle another massive workload. And that amounted to 27.8% of these running backs on this list that missed more than half a season in their following year. So that number is very concerning right there, but it's not like all of them missed a full, half the season. So just more information to glean from this whole research right here. Now, very, very notable here is that all the players who increased touches the following year on a per touch basis got injured. Every last one of these guys who got more touches on a per game basis, they all went down with injury because their bodies could not sustain another year of maximum volume production here. Derrick Henry is a great example of a guy who was built for this type of workload, but he couldn't even handle it the following year. Every last one of these guys that increased volume, touch per game basis, they all went down with injury and missed more than half a season. That's insane volume here. So essentially what that should tell you here is that if Saquon Barkley is in a situation in Philadelphia where they decide, no, we actually just want to continue to give him more volume, that he's going to get injured. It's 100% chance based on history and statistics here. So that's not a good thing for Philadelphia to do. And even if they actually ended up lightening his workload, that's going to mean that he probably might not finish as the RB1, which is exactly where he's being priced at, unfortunately, as we all know. And 61.1% of these players finished as a running back 15 or worse the following year. So again, everything that this research shows says that history is not on Saquon Barkley's side to repeat as the running back 1 in fantasy football. And what you'll also notice here is that two guys from last year also had 350 plus touches or more. It was Bijan Robinson, the RB2, and Kyron Williams, the running back 11 in underdog drafts right now. So with these two guys right here, they also fit this criteria of, in all likelihood, losing volume and dropping down as a fantasy finisher in 2025 fantasy football. So the history is just not on Bijan Robinson's, Saquon Barkley's, and Kyron Williams' side in 2025 to sustain that production they got last year, to surpass that production, or to finish within like 2 or 3 spots within. The only guy who did it over the years was Ezekiel Elliott, who was actually able to manage 355 total touches after a 381 touch year. He was the only guy who could even get close to that number again, though. So it's just not on the side of these guys. Now, again, this video is about risk taking. I'm not telling you guys that you should not draft Saquon Barkley. I've drafted Saquon. I've drafted Bijan. I've drafted Kyron Williams. In fact, I was particularly big on Kyron Williams as a value really kind of up until this point that I discovered all this research. So I'm going to make the case for these guys that you should take the risk on them. I don't think Saquon Barkley, I need to explain the calculated risks you could take and the upside he could bring. So I'm going to kind of skip over him. And I also kind of feel like Bijan Robinson is in a similar boat where I don't really need to explain to you the positive upside that there is with Bijan in 2025. I think you understand that as well. I think the one big thing with me is Kyron Williams. Kyron Williams is a guy who actually is at a really reasonable price compared to his last 2 seasons' finishes in fantasy football. Again, being priced as the running back 11 or running back 12 in underdog fantasy football drafts. So he's going in like the 3rd, 4th round right now in underdog drafts. That's a really good price for a guy who should handle the majority of the workload in Los Angeles just based on depth chart. Like, Blake Corum did nothing last year, showed nothing, and then they drafted Jarquez Hunter, who I believe was brought in to replace Blake Corum because he's no good. There's also talks about Kyron Williams getting an extension. They would not give an extension to this guy if they did not plan on making him their workhorse yet again. So I do think there's lots of upside here with the value that you could get from a guy like Kyron Williams. So I'm not out on Kyron Williams whatsoever. I do think that Kyron Williams is a huge concern of mine, though. And I think he's very, very risky because he made this list of guys. So I'm still going to tell you guys, draft Saquon Barkley. Like, don't be that guy who passes on Saquon Barkley at the 105 or something like that if he falls to you. If he falls to you there, take Saquon Barkley. If Bijan Robinson falls to you at the 105, 106, 107, you got to take Bijan Robinson. But I will just say this. If these guys don't end up hitting within 5 or 6 spots of where you drafted them at, they're going to be disappointments, and you could have possibly seen this coming. So getting into our next guy right here that I want to start out with, it's a guy that I've already discussed here this offseason. It's A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown is a guy that I don't particularly think is a very good selection in fantasy football drafts this year. He's the wide receiver 10 on Underdog. He's a second round pick value, and I just don't think that it's a particularly great move. But I also, in that video where I was discussing bad picks and bad values, I was also saying, obviously it's not lost on me that A.J. Brown has upside. You're going to get boom games with A.J. Brown, and it's particularly valuable in a best ball format. So I want to go through some research that applies to A.J. Brown that I've also been doing over the last 11 years. So dating back to 2014, I wanted to get the guys who had finished as top 12 wide receivers in a particular season, and I wanted to also kind of look at these guys that were kind of fishes out of water in a sense. So you can see on this list right here that all these guys, from a yards per reception perspective, all of them had above 15 yards per reception. Now that's a really, really high number. You can kind of go through the history of top 12 wide receivers. They're typically, averaging anywhere from like 11 to like 13, maybe 14 yards per reception on the higher end. But if you get a top 12 guy who's averaging 15 yards per reception, that's unusual. That's an unusual number right there. And as we know, yards per reception is not a sticky stat in fantasy football, which I will prove a little bit later on. So I wanted to essentially just get these guys, see if they did have a consecutive top 12 season the following year after this major yards per reception route. And then you want to also see the targets before and the targets after. So I wanted to know what the target number was for them in the top 12 season and then the target number the following year. So that's the list of guys right here. So what I wanted to do to make this kind of easier to digest is I wanted to split these guys up into two different categories. Guys that did repeat and then guys that did not repeat as top 12 wide receivers in fantasy. So we're going to go through the guys who did not repeat. And it is a larger number than the guys who did repeat, obviously. So these guys right here, what you will notice, and I think what should jump out off the page to you right away, only one of these guys, Mike Evans, was able to sustain/grow in yards per reception the following year. 94.4% of these guys dropped in yards per reception. AKA, it is the least sticky stat in fantasy football, maybe aside from touchdowns. I could actually make the argument touchdowns are a little bit more sticky. But this is one that is not sticky whatsoever. Mike Evans is an ultimate outlier at this position because he's basically been doing this type of statistic for his entire career. Now, what you also need to come away taking away here is the average number of targets the following year after the top 12 season is 96.6 targets. So let's go ahead and look back at some of these guys in their top 12 year. These guys are having, 123 targets, 131 targets, 143, 143, 107, 117. Like, these guys are kind of all over the map. And I think that there's only a couple guys realistically that you can isolate from this particular group and say that we're actually true bona fide number one wide receivers. Guys like Mike Evans has been a number one wide receiver for Tampa Bay for his entire career. T.Y. Hilton, for a long time, was a number one wide receiver in fantasy football and in Indianapolis for a number of years. A.J. Green, also a number one wide receiver for Cincinnati. Amari Cooper, at one time, was a wide receiver one for his teams. A.J. Brown, Calvin Ridley, Deebo Samuel. But there's a lot of guys on this list as well who have always been kind of wide receiver twos. Guys like Jalen Waddle, Mike Williams, Chris Godwin, Devontae Parker, Marvin Jones Jr., Allen Robinson. There's a lot of guys who just did not have a clear path to getting more volume a following year. So those are guys that you just kind of wanted to stay away from in the future because you knew that YPR number was not going to be sticky at all. And they also just didn't have a clear path forward to getting more volume. So you wanted to stay away from these types of guys. So 77.8% of these guys, they lost targets the following year. And again, that's attributable to the fact that these guys were not, the majority of them, considered wide receiver ones on their own team. So now we're going to move over to the guys who did repeat the following season, right? Now you can see a lot of these guys immediately, what should jump off the page to you is that a lot of them are wide receiver ones or were at one time for their respective teams. So their volume was always going to be really, really good. Julio Jones, Odell Beckham Jr., Tyreek Hill, Antonio Brown, Mike Evans, DK Metcalf, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, yada, yada, yada. These guys have always been their wide receiver ones on their respective teams. So when their yards per reception dipped, they were able to maintain a top 12 status because of the fact they were getting tons of targets. So the average number of targets here was 151.3 amongst all these guys. That is a staggering almost 60 target difference from the guys who did not repeat. That is a crazy difference here. So yes, that is a huge deal that you have to take into account because these wide receivers had a clear path to go get more volume, or they did not have a clear path to go get more volume because they were already the number one wide receivers in their own offenses. So 63.6% of these guys gained targets the following year. And again, the thing you also need to take away here was that this yards per reception number is so not sticky whatsoever. 83.3% of these guys dropped in yards per reception. Now, there's a lot of factors for that, right? If you get more volume, you're going to lose yards per reception in all likelihood. But still, the lesson here is that yards per reception is a very unsticky number. Now, the good news is that none of our top 12 wide receivers last year ended up being 15 yards per reception guys or higher. These were all guys that were outside of the top 15. Outside of the top 20. But I do think they are worth mentioning here because of the fact that they are higher in ADP. So A.J. Brown is one of these guys. And again, I have my issues with A.J. Brown because A.J. Brown lost 2 targets on a per game basis from 2023 to 2024. That does not bode well for a future top 12 visit in fantasy football. And when you're being drafted as the wide receiver 10, yeah, I'm going to have some serious issues with that because I don't see you having much upside to finish above the wide receiver 10 if you can't get that volume back. But again, there's other guys who fit in this criteria right here, and it's Jameson Williams, Calvin Ridley, DK Metcalf, and George Pickens. All 4 of these guys, other than A.J. Brown, also had a ridiculous YPR in 2024. Jameson Williams, it was 17.3. Calvin Ridley, 15.9. DK Metcalf, 15. And George Pickens, 15.3. The highest number of targets out of all 5 of these guys was Calvin Ridley at 120 targets. Now, of course, there was some guys who missed time, right? A.J. Brown missed some time. Jameson Williams missed a couple games. George Pickens missed some time. DK missed a couple games as well. But the majority rule here is that these guys are not averaging many yards, many targets per game. These guys are hovering around 7 targets per game, 6 targets per game, and they're all being valued as top 30 wide receivers right now in underdog drafts. And I think it's pretty risky to be valuing these guys at this position right here because A.J. Brown is the wide receiver 1 in Philadelphia. But again, I have issues seeing A.J. Brown in a position where Philadelphia is going to be pass first this year. Now, I get it. I just said Saquon Barkley is going to lose volume this year, and I do think Jalen Hurts will throw the ball more this year. So there is positives here that I can also acknowledge. Potentially worth taking the risk. That's up to you. Jameson Williams is not a guy I particularly see getting tons more targets on a per game basis than 6.1. I just don't think he's that kind of level of receiver. Now, again, I'm willing to take the shot on him in certain drafts, see if he can absolutely just come up and finish above ADP of wide receiver 26 after a wide receiver 19 finish because he is on a contract year. So Jameson Williams is an interesting player, but not one that I have particularly invested much in on my own best ball teams. Calvin Ridley is a guy I don't really want much to do with, to be honest with you. Wide receiver 31 on underdog, wide receiver 27 finished last year. He's playing with a rookie quarterback, and there's a whole other set of research that suggests that wide receivers with rookie quarterbacks typically not something you want to come after in fantasy football the following year. DK Metcalf, this is a guy who I'm still not sure how I feel about. Clear wide receiver 1 in Pittsburgh now. Is it Aaron Rodgers? Is it Mason Rudolph? We don't know yet. So one way or the other, like he could have a really decent quarterback throwing in the ball, Aaron Rodgers, or he could have someone who really doesn't belong as a starter, Mason Rudolph. So DK Metcalf is in a funny position here at the wide receiver 28 after a wide receiver 32 finish in 2024. I see upside. I've taken DK a couple times, but I'm definitely not fully on board with DK Metcalf, so that one's up to you. George Pickens is a guy I've already said not interested in. Not interested in this wide receiver 30 price for a wide receiver 42 and a former Pittsburgh Steeler wide receiver who also, there's a whole nother set of research on that side that suggests former Steelers wide receivers, you want to stay away from them. But these guys are all very risky based on these types of numbers right here. So that is ultimately up for you to decide. Like I said, I like to take risks in life. In life, fantasy football, it's all the same to me. There's upside with these guys. There's also potential big-time bust potential with a lot of these guys on this list based on the research that we went today. So if you do want to give yourself a chance at winning some big money, taking a big risk on some of these guys, you could go down in the comments, grab the link that's there. You can get into one of these underdog drafts. The Schnauzer is a $3 draft. That draft is actually about to close, so you'd have to get in on that either today or tomorrow. You're also going to be able to get into Best Ball Mania, the $25 draft. That's a pretty sweet draft. $2 million is the first place right there. So what you can do is use code FFN. They'll match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 when you use code FFN. And I won $19,000 playing best ball drafts last year because I was taking risks on a lot of these types of players and it paid off. So let me know what you ultimately think of the guys we went through today. And if you want to see the best discounts in 2025 drafts right now, click on this video right here.